So here's one worm bin system with cinder blocks. You can see in that corner there's another worm bin system with straw bales, which is another option. Though the reason why George and Jonathan developed this cinder block system is because fire ants love to live in those straw bales, and we have the hardest time with fire ants down here. And so, you know, this does not provide as ideal an environment for the fire ants to proliferate in, which is why they went with the cinder blocks. But I would say, you know, we experienced success with the straw bales, with the exception of the fire ant problem. And another thing is that those straw bales provided great insulation during the winter time. We were able to maintain these worm bins, those straw bale worm bins, throughout the winter. The bedding was warm enough. The worms were actively feeding on the food we were giving them, and we had no problem maintaining those worm bins all through the winter. And the same way in the summer, having that insulation layer would help buffer the temperature, keep it from getting too hot. You know, because like I said in my presentation, it's really that, it's like, you know, 60 to 75 degrees is an ideal temperature range for these worms, though they can handle temperatures on either extreme. But I wanted to talk about this other worm bin system. So this is a commercial worm bin called a can of worms. Yeah, clever name. This is manufactured in Australia, and you can find a lot of these commercial worm bins available. One benefit to these systems is the fact that it has stackable trays. And so in this system, you start off with one tray here. You add the bedding material to the tray, make sure it's nice and moist, and then you add the food to that in layers on the top, or you can bury the food in the bedding. And then, you know, you continue to feed the worms in this bottom tray until the tray fills. And then once that tray fills, you insert another tray, repeat the steps, add bedding, add food, feed until this tray fills. The worms will actually move up from the lower trays up to the trays above. Like I was saying, these red wigglers prefer to live on the surface of the bedding. They're surface dwellers, so they'll instinctually move upwards. You know, the holes are big enough to allow the worms to pass through. And so you're continuing to feed and stack from the top. And so in the end, say once you get to finishing off this tray, ideally the bottom tray really should be full of finished castings. So then at this point, all you do is you dump out that bottom tray of castings. It might have some stragglers left in it. And then you move, you know, the second tray to the bottom, and then put that bottom tray on the top, and then keep feeding from there. So the bins circulate, the worms continue to move up, you keep feeding on the top, and it's a really great system. The biggest downside though is this bin's made of plastic, and that can encourage anaerobic environments, especially at the corners here. You know, it starts to kind of get anaerobic, kind of mucky here in the corners, since the plastic itself doesn't breathe. But I've seen beautiful wooden stackable worm bins, which is something I would say, you know, would be worth looking into if you want to set up a small scale vermicompost system.
That's what I have, and that's what got taken over by the soldiers finally.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So there you go. It can be anaerobic then.
What's the spigot for?
Okay, thanks for asking. So the spigot is to allow excess moisture to drain out of the system. And so, you know, you have all these holes in the bottom of the tray. If you need to add water to maintain the moist environment, excess water can then drain through the system, and you can pour it off here. A note about that is that some people call that worm tea, vermicompost tea, which I feel like is inaccurate. I mean, because when we're talking about compost tea, we're talking about an actively aerated brew, where those microbes are fed, brewed in an aerobic environment for say, 24 hours. So you are feeding and encouraging the growth of these beneficial aerobic microbes. That's not the same thing that's coming out of that spigot. That, I would consider that vermicompost leachate, which would be appropriate to add in your garden to the soil or add in the compost bin, but it is a potential source for contamination with human pathogens. I mean, you don't know if your worm bin is anaerobic, it could have some human or plant pathogens in it that aren't being suppressed by aerobic organisms. So I would be reluctant to use that to spray on plant leaves or to spray on edible crops, but it would definitely be fine for soil application and has a lot of beneficial properties. And then a note on harvesting the worms. So, I was talking about dumping out the bin, the finished castings. What if you have worms left in that? How do you get those worms out? Well, one thing I really like to do is to dump it on a tray or a tarp that's in sunlight, exposed to sun, or maybe under a lamp, and then mound that vermicompost into a pile, kind of a conical shape, and exposed to the light, those worms will start to burrow towards the center of the pile to get away from the light. And so what you can do is then come back about an hour later and scrape away the outside of the pile until you start to see worms. They'll see the light and start burrowing deeper. So about every hour you can come back, scrape away more of the outer layers of that pile until eventually you're left with this writhing mass of worms in the middle, which then, you put, say, in this system you'd put it in the top tray, where they have food, and then you have your worm castings, which then you can screen. I like, a half or quarter-inch mesh screen out any, large portions of material, which can then be added back to the bin. And then you're left with this beautiful, dark, rich material right here, which is sifted worm castings from the bins here, which you can
that
come.
Came out of the can of worms.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, which you can come look at if you want. And then that method could also be used for the larger bins. Piling the material, letting the worms burrow deep, and then pulling the worm castings, away on the outer layers. Though George has a different strategy in mind for how he's going to deal with this bin right here that I'll let him describe.
Yeah, I'll mention one thing, and another one of the reasons that I'm not going to use straw bales as my immediate upper anymore. When I tried that method, you get a lot of contamination from the straw. For one thing, the wires break down on the straw bales, and you have all this straw mixed in, and it's real difficult to easily scrape away the material with that straw there. So that's one reason that we went to the block bin. Also, my tentative plan at this point is to, I guess you could say I think you had on the slide, management by death. It's kind of what you're going to do. As this bin gets to the point where I'm seeing that I want to move on with the worms, I will concentrate the food that we put in there and this has to be planned ahead of time, allow enough time for the worms to really focus on that food, go in and harvest them, and put them into a new bin.
So you're saying basically like you might feed them in this corner and allow everybody to migrate from the rest of the bin to that food, and then you could harvest that for compost and this to move to new bin?
Not yet. No, you're going too fast.
Sorry.
We'll be harvesting worms. I don't know how long we'll do that, but we'll reach a point where I'm just going to say, okay, that's it for this bin, and just going to walk away from it. And basically, the ones that are still left here will consume whatever's left, and they will basically die in their own waste with time. And you know, if you are not adding additional food, they end up consuming their own waste until that's it. And then we will have something close to finished castings, which, you know, at some point in time will screen. I have not gone through that complete process yet to say how long that is going to take, but it is the low labor means of managing this type of system. So that is our current strategy. I foresee having 4, 6, 8 bins here, however we design them, ultimately under this shelter. That's, you know, a possible future for this. But I could see us, if we are able to process enough waste, of doing that here.
With the concrete blocks, you don't have too big of a problem if it gets direct sun. The reason I ask, the can of worms, if it ever gets in the sun, heats up
it's black for one thing.
dramatically just in a short time, and the worms start jumping for their lives at the top.
Right. You know, this is the first time we're doing it quite this way. I think if I need any insulation here against the sun, I can put the straw bales against the outside.
Good point. Yeah.
And that's what I plan to do in winter for insulation. But it'll be on the outside of the blocks.
So it's not touching.
Right.
And you've got enough thermal mass there too that it's not going to heat up.
Yeah, these are reflective. Actually, it wouldn't hurt if we came along and whitewashed the outside of the blocks. And I'm thinking of doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Can you not just throw the worms and the castings and everything on your garden? Or
Yes.
Yeah, you can.
will they not?
Though I would prefer to save those worms for another worm bin. The thing is that, you know, like I was talking about, the natural habitat for these worms is in that organic litter layer, right? So unless you have your garden mulched, you know, year round, and that mulch is a good food source for these worms, I would say your garden wouldn't be the ideal climate, ideal situation, ideal environment for these worms. Though, you know, after you screen, sift your worm castings, you're still going to end up with viable eggs, you know, cocoons in your worm castings, which then you're going to be, say, applying to the garden. So in that way,
I want to explain the grid.
Yeah, so in that way, you know, you'd be adding some of these red wiggler worms to your garden. But really, they're better adapted for these worm bin systems. And then in your garden, you want to encourage these, I mean, they're not exactly native, but, you know, your garden earthworms through mulching and adequate organic matter levels. And another thing that's added to these worm bins is lime, or you can use rock powders, azomite, like I was talking about, for the compost. I mean, in addition to providing these micronutrients, those materials provide grit for these worms. And like I briefly talked about in my presentation, you know, they do have a crop and they grind their food in that crop, so they need a certain amount of grit, which can be provided by through adding soil or adding, you know, rock powders. But you know, those trace minerals and, say, azomite or other rock dust are really beneficial to the worm bin ecosystem. And biochar is another good addition to a worm bin, because like in the compost pile, the biochar will be charged with moisture and nutrients and colonized by beneficial microbes. So that if you have biochar, that's another good thing to add to the worm bin.